right, let's testify tonight.
Oh God, you've done so much for me. I'm grateful and overwhelmed here at your feet. And I could stay here forever, Lord, but you call me to something more. And I hear you say that you have a plan to use every broken woman and man to display just how good you are. We are your living pieces of art. What good does it do to hide away when all of my scars are a picture of grace? All right. So I will testify of the power of God. I will tell the world of the hope I have found. For my body was broken, my heart was made whole, and that's too good to keep to myself. So I will testify of the power of God.
All right, let's testify tonight.
Oh God, you've done so much for me. I'm grateful and overwhelmed here at your feet. And I could stay here forever, Lord, but you call me to something more. And I hear you say that you have a plan to use every broken woman and man to display just how good you are. We are your living pieces of art. What good does it do to hide away when all of my scars are a picture of grace? All right. So I will testify of the power of God. Tell the world of the hope I have found. For my body was broken, my heart was made whole, and that's too good to keep to myself. So I will testify of the power of God. Oh, do you believe it? Has He done it for anyone else? I said, has He done it for anyone else? Cause the God that I serve, He's always at work. Has He done it for anyone else? So come on and testify of the power of God. Come on and tell the world of the hope we have found. For our body was broken, our hearts were made whole, and that's too good to keep to yourself. Come on and testify of the power of God. This is my story, this is my song, praising my Savior all the day long. I'm gonna testify. Somebody testify your voice. This is my. So I'm gonna testify. Somebody testify. Come on, take it out. Jesus, my champion, the victor of grace, the only one worthy of all of my praise. Yeah. So come on and testify. Oh, somebody lift Him high. Come on, testify. tell the world of the hope I have found. Oh, for my body was broken, my heart was made whole, and that's too good to keep to myself. So I will testify of the power of God. Sing that. Oh, my body was broken, my heart was made whole, and that's too good to keep to myself. So I will testify of the power of God. Oh, let's do that right now. Murfreesboro.
And good morning, everybody. Hope that you're all doing well. Let's see, wow, how does that get knocked out of whack? Let me fix that. Anyway, so too far. Go back. Hair is all frizzy, of course. All right. So today we are in Acts chapter 23. For those of you who don't know, 23 happens to be my favorite number. Some of you probably know why. But we're continuing with the trial of Paul, which has been quite interesting so far. And unlike many of Jesus's other apostles and disciples, Paul, he's a debater. He's a fighter. And like Paul is, if I would say something like that, Paul would be my spirit animal. He loves to intellectually clash with others. So I think that, he's kind of my biblical hero, if you will. So we'll see where this goes. So Alex Bogey, first in the house, says, checking in from the gym. Good to see you, Alex. Yasher says, Mary's physical union with God, birthing Jesus, embodies divine grace, shaping my belief in love, consent, and spiritual unity. Okay. Not sure exactly what your point in that is. Although I would question the use of the term Mary's physical union with God, because it's not like, she had sexual relations with the Holy Spirit or something. The camera keeps... Is it just me, or does the camera keep moving? Let's do that again. That's just weird. Gimbal control. Try it again. All right. Okay. And so how today we'll likely use the pool afterwards. Well, I'm jealous I don't have access to a pool. I wish I had a pool, because that would be like the one form of exercise I may still be able to do. Trustin says, good morning / afternoon. Good to see you, Trustin. Youngster says, the camera is moving. I said moving. Yeah, it was weird. And Aravic says, good morning. How you doing, my friend? Hope you are well. All right, so... And Creep is here, so we can get started. Good to see you, Creep. So let me switch scenes here. And we'll get our text up here on the screen. So this is Acts chapter 23. Starting at verse 1. Paul looked straight at the Sanhedrin and said, my brothers, I have fulfilled my duty to God in all good conscience to this day. At this, the high priest Ananias ordered those standing near Paul to strike him on the mouth. Then Paul said to him, God will strike you, you whitewashed wall. You sit there to judge me according to the law, yet you yourself violate the law by commanding that I be struck. Now you see, once again, this is Paul using intellectual argumentation to prove his point. It's kind of like when I try to show that there are churches out there, far too many, that will do things that are directly contradictory to what God says we ought to do. Now, we're not bound by the Old Testament law in the same way that the Jews are. However, if someone is blatantly going to teach that something is okay, that the Bible says is not okay, you're being just as bad as this Pharisee who ordered one of the Sanhedrin to strike Paul. And to kind of go back to something that me and Alex have argued about in the past, is that this is a form of Paul turning the other cheek. Paul does not get violent here. He simply points out their hypocrisy. And that certainly is not weakness. I understand that, like you've tried to make the argument that you don't want to be weak, which, fine, but being weak or being strong doesn't necessarily mean being violent. So I have to adjust my backrest a little bit there. Those who were standing near Paul said, "How dare you insult God's high priest?" Paul replied, "Brothers, I did not realize he was the high priest, for it is written, 'Do not speak evil about the ruler of your people.'" Then Paul, so notice, I think this is, and maybe I'm wrong, maybe there'll be something up here to contradict this, but I think I don't think he's being sarcastic or anything like that, because Paul is definitely one of those law and order kind of guys. So if somebody is truly in a position of authority, Paul tends to respect it, even to the point where he was executed. Then Paul, knowing that some of them were Sadducees and others Pharisees, called out to the Sanhedrin, "My brothers, I'm a Pharisee, descended from Pharisees. I stand on trial because of the hope of the resurrection of the dead." When he said this, a dispute broke out between the Pharisees and Sadducees, and the assembly was divided. The Sadducees say that there is no resurrection, and that there is neither angels nor spirits, but the Pharisees believe all these things. So Paul is using their own insecurities against each other now. I do think it's interesting that the Sadducees say there's no resurrection. These people were high officials in the Jewish church at the time. And so there was division within Judaism about what happens to you after you die. Now, granted, the Old Testament doesn't talk of the afterlife like the New Testament does, but I do think that's interesting that there was not unity among the leadership, even back then. There was a great uproar, and some of the teachers of the law who were Pharisees stood up and argued vigorously. "We find nothing wrong with this man," they said. "What if a spirit or an angel has spoken to him?" The dispute became so violent that the commander was afraid Paul would be torn to pieces by them. He ordered the troops to go down and take him away from them by force and bring him to the barracks. The following night, the Lord stood near Paul and said, "Take courage, as you have testified about me in Jerusalem, so you must also testify in Rome." So after all this, when Paul he didn't lift a finger, but he managed to kind of outsmart them a bit. And Jesus shows up while he's sitting in his jail cell saying, "Guess what? You're going to do all this again." The next morning, some Jews formed a conspiracy and bound themselves with an oath not to eat or drink until they had killed Paul. More than 40 men were involved in this plot. They went to the chief priests and the elders and said, "We have taken a solemn oath not to eat anything until we have killed Paul. Now then, you and the Sanhedrin petition the commander to bring him before you on the pretext of wanting more accurate information about his case. We are ready to kill him before he gets here." But when the son of Paul's sister heard of this plot, he went into the barracks and told Paul. Then Paul called one of the centurions and said, "Take this young man to the commander. He has something to tell him." So he took him to the commander. The centurion said, "Paul, the prisoner, sent for me and asked for me to bring this young man to you because he had something to tell you." The commander took the young man by the hand, drew him aside, and asked, "What is it you want to tell me?" He said, "Some Jews have agreed to ask you to bring Paul before the Sanhedrin tomorrow on the pretext of wanting more accurate information about him. Don't give in to them, because more than 40 of them are waiting in ambush for him. They have taken an oath not to eat or drink until they have killed him. They are ready now, waiting for your consent to their request." The commander dismissed the young man with this warning: "Don't tell anyone that you have reported this to me." So, obviously the Sanhedrin are plotting to kill Paul because the Sanhedrin are opposed. And this is interesting because this falls right into what some atheists argue about religion, that the horrible things that people will do and how easy it is to manipulate people with religion. To which I say that's totally correct. You can use religion to manipulate people into doing horrible things. That doesn't mean Christianity is wrong. And that's the important takeaway from that, is that you're just arguing. And the funny thing is that these same atheists are the ones that that point out how Christians tend to argue from this consequentialism, where they say, "How can you say the universe has no purpose and there's no meaning to life, blah, 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 blah. There's no absolute morality." And they would say, "Look, just because you don't like it doesn't mean it's not true." Well, same thing is true about when we talk about things like this. You may not like that because religion cuts so close to the core of who we are, and that our religious beliefs are so important to us that if we are misled, we can be manipulated into doing horrible things. That doesn't mean Christianity is untrue. Then two of his centurions had ordered him, "Get ready a detachment of 200 soldiers, 70 horsemen, and 200 spearmen. Go to Caesarea at 9 tonight. Provide horses for Paul that he may be taken safely to Governor Felix." He wrote a letter as follows: "Claudius Lysias, to his excellency Governor Felix. Greetings. This man was seized by the Jews, and they were about to kill him, but I came with my troops and rescued him, for I learned that he is a Roman citizen. I wanted to know why they were accusing him, so I brought him to their Sanhedrin. I found that the accusation had to do with questions about their law, but there was no charge against him that deserved death or imprisonment. When I was informed of a plot to be carried out against the man, I sent him to you at once. I also ordered his accusers to present to you their case against him." So he's basically passing the buck. So the soldiers, carrying out their orders, took Paul with them during the night and brought him as far as Antipatris. The next day, they let the cavalry go on with him while they returned to their barracks. When the cavalry arrived in Caesarea, they delivered the letter to the governor and handed Paul over to him. The governor read the letter and asked what province he was from. Learning that he was from Cecilia, or Cecilia, he said, "I will hear your case when your accusers get here." Then he ordered that Paul be kept under guard in Herod's palace. So Paul's citizenship becomes critically important in his ministry. Because we'll see here, not only did Paul, plant a whole bunch of churches, convert a bunch of people, but then he gets the opportunity to testify before the Jewish leadership, the Pharisees and the Sanhedrin. But because of his citizenship, he's spared execution there. And he's going to go all the way to Rome and actually place his case before the emperor himself. And so that, that was all part of this plan by God to get the message out. And I think it's interesting, when we argue about the historicity of the Bible. Look, I know there are people that think that everything in the Bible is just made up stories, but then how is it, and genuine question, how is it that even as far back as the late 1st into the 2nd century, Christianity had spread so much? If there were no people there to found Christianity, if the early church, as described in the book of Acts, didn't even exist, where did the church come from? It doesn't, and why is it that we can corroborate a lot of these events outside of the Bible? Food for thought. And to the chat we go, if you guys have anything to say today. All right, so, right, Stanley O. He says to Stanley, saying, let's get this party started right. Did they die of starvation? You would think so. I don't know if we ever find out what happened to them. So I honestly don't know. We'll see as we get through the book of Acts. Michael in chat, headphones on. I need to dress grandson. I love you, Penny. I truly do, but you don't have to tell us that. Creep is creeping at Penny. It was God's divine will that Paul gets to Rome. Absolutely it was. And this is one of those things, like when we argue about is there free will or no free will. I genuinely believe there is free will, but I also believe that God is omnipotent, omniscient, and exists outside of space-time. And as such, he can see the consequences of his actions as he does it and then change them. He can basically, as he's going through it, manipulate the timeline, as it were. And, besides giving him supreme power, it means that we can still make our own free will choices, but sometimes our free will choices would be altered because of something that happens earlier in our life. And so what may happen, and this is one of the reasons that I talk to people sometimes about when we get angry about certain things happening in our lives. But sometimes, let's say that, pick something bad. You have a family member who passes away younger than you would expect. Kind of like my sister-in-law passed away. But because your relative passed away, you were really, really straining as far as your belief in God. And so because of that, you were thinking about leaving the church. And because of that, another person in the church helped console you and get you through this crisis of faith. And because of that, that person's faith was strengthened. And because of that, they were able to more properly bring up their own children. And because of that, their children ended up becoming great evangelists. See, and so that death in the family could have had some consequence, even generations down the road that we don't know about, that fit into the plan, so to speak. But the other piece of that is that, what are the events that led up to that death? Like when people argue about, did God want Hitler to do what he did in the 1940s? And I don't think he wanted that to happen, but it's also entirely possible, and in fact, I would say probable, that he knows what would happen to the world if that didn't happen, and the world would be worse off for it. I think it's really cool that the Romans protected their citizens like that. Yeah, it actually was. But too bad the United States doesn't. Actually, neither do any of the modern European countries really care so much about their citizens anymore. They care more about the people who are not citizens that live in their borders. Whereas in Rome, they didn't have an immigration problem because Jews in Israel were still citizens of Israel, but not all of them were citizens of Rome. And being a citizen of Rome afforded you federal protection, like what we're seeing with Paul, as well as access to certain things and immunity from certain things. I remember in the other chapter the other day, they were going to flog Paul, but you don't flog citizens, because citizens get due process first. Yuckster says, I believe there's a mistranslation in the Old Testament. A word is not virgin, it's woman age that is considered marriage age. So the mistranslation is corrupted, the Christian church believes. Okay, if I'm understanding what you're saying, okay, is that, and I do understand that there are words that are translated as virgin that could also mean just a woman of marriageable age, right? Let me see. I'm looking for something specifically here as far as no, I don't want that. Yeah, so in Luke, the term is parthenos, which normally refer to an unmarried woman of marriageable age. And let's see. But in Matthew 1:25, it specifically says that she did not consummate her marriage until after she gave birth to a son. And so there's one other that I'm trying to find because it actually specifically says that Mary had not lain with a man prior to this. But I don't remember what the passage is for that. So let's see. Let's see. Anyway, but yeah, so I think that while the word that Luke used, you could simply say means a young woman. There are other passages that definitely imply that she had not had sexual relations until after Christ was born. Now, let me ask you this. Does it honestly, as far as who and what Christ was, does it really matter? And I think the answer to that is clearly no. However, I also don't see any reason why that's something worth scrutinizing because it doesn't change anything. It doesn't mean anything, at least nothing radical. If, in fact, let's say you could absolutely prove that that Mary had sex prior to. I mean, I guess you could argue, well, that means Jesus might not have been God's because they didn't have DNA tests back then. But come on. Creep says, haven't had the chance to watch your sex ed stream yet. How did that go? Not bad, actually. And so, for those of you that don't know, last Friday we talked about sexual immorality. I thought it was a decent stream. Historical marriages for people like royalty could seem pretty weird. Yeah, and you know, virginity itself was highly prized back then. It wasn't like today where nobody really gives a crap. And part of that was because it was considered sinful to have sex, and it still is sinful to have sex outside of marriage. It's just that nowadays we just think, oh, come on, let the kids have their fun. It doesn't really matter if it's, you know, a violation of what God's commandments are. And Creep saying inbreeders. Not sure why. I assume it's historical, but the new Game of Thrones show has a widowed king who needs to remarry, and the most politically beneficial choice is the daughter of another great house. Okay, well, I don't watch Game of Thrones, but that's also, I mean, that's not atypical for marriage back then. And then Creep says PDF files. Not sure why. Now, when it comes to free will, free wheel, and God's will, it might be a little like the butterfly effect. The smallest actions by God can have huge effects on a larger scale. How would we really know? Yeah, exactly. And so it's entirely possible that, like, God just nudged a pebble a quarter of an inch in one direction and it changed whole empires because somebody tripped over it, you know? It's like, what's the Japanese saying, for lack of a nail, a horseshoe was lost. For lack of a horseshoe, a horse was unable to run. For lack of a horse, a message was not delivered. For lack of a message, the troops were not deployed. For lack of deployment, we lost the war. You know, something to that effect. So you could argue because of one nail, the war was lost. Even though she's 12, though at least they point out that she wouldn't be expected to bed him until she was at least 14. Well, first of all, we don't know she was 12. We don't know. The Bible never clearly states what Mary's age was. However, back then, the way that marriage worked, and this is something that people, it's a societal thing, I know. Because today we look at it, and this is what I talked about before, is presentism, where we're trying to take our modern standards on things and superimpose those on an ancient writing. However, the standard at the time was that a woman would get married as soon as she went through puberty. And so, generally speaking, betrothals would happen between the ages of like 6 and 12, and the actual marriage would take place immediately upon the puberty. And so Mary was betrothed to Joseph It was saying that they were actually married, but they had not consummated their relationship as of yet, probably meaning that she hadn't, had her first cycle. And, but then she got the message that she was going to bear the Son of God. And, I do get tired of people accusing various historical figures. Like, for example, look, I am not a Muslim. I don't agree with Muslim tradition pretty much at all. But I don't necessarily just buy into the whole Muhammad was a pedophile because he married a 6-year-old kind of thing. Because that's presentism. Did he actually have sexual relations with a 6-year-old? I don't think that's in the Quran. If it is, hey, I'm wrong. But that was just the way that things were done back then. Think about, it's funny because nobody gets angry at Spock and T'Pring from Star Trek. Same thing. Stanley says, I just feel bad for Mary's later husbands. There's no mention that Mary ever remarried. And we don't know what happened to Joseph except that he seemed to be gone by the time Jesus was doing his ministry. Which also, given typical ages for marriage back then, would not be unusual. But whether or not Mary ever took a new husband or anything like that, we don't know. Imagine having to follow God. Well, yeah, it's crazy to think about. And honestly, that's one of the reasons I like, if you haven't seen it, the series The Chosen, which is a completely fictional show about the apostles and their encounters with Jesus and how that affected their lives. And it didn't just do the standard biblical movie stuff where they go around and do the miracles. There is some of that. But there's a lot of just getting to know the apostles and seeing how their lives were impacted by following Jesus. And I will tell you, again, it's all fictional. We don't have any record. Like, for example, Simon Peter's wife is a big part of this series. And we get to know a lot about Peter's home life with him and his brother, who was a follower of John the Baptist and then Jesus, and how this turned their whole world upside down. Matthew was, very little was known about him other than that he was a tax collector prior to being a follower. And so they made him autistic, which some people were offended by, but I really like his character. Anyway, and they just show all these guys and what happened to them as they got to know each other and Jesus. And it's funny because there's mentions of like some of the infighting and stuff in the Bible between the disciples, but this really gets to it. Like, for example, how some of the disciples got really pissed off. It just happened in a very recent episode where Jesus renamed Simon to Peter. And the other disciples are like, whoa, how come he gets a new name? And what's all this? Because everybody wanted to be, Jesus's number one guy. Yeah, she was always talking about her ex. Okay. Guys hate that. Sorry, it's a continuation of my Game of Thrones example. No problem. Just how standards have changed, exactly. Yeah, we got to be very careful about applying modern standards onto stuff like that because it's not fair. Especially during the act, she's always... Oh, Stan, come on, buddy. Come on. That's taking it way too far. What about Neelix and Kess? You see, but that's just weird because why would Kess be attracted to a hedgehog? I don't understand that. And, but like the Ocampa and Voyager, since they only have a lifespan of like 5 years, and Kess was something like 3 years old or whatever when they met her. And so people are like, ew, he's with a 3-year-old. But it's like, well, but it's a 3-year-old of a 5-year lifespan. What was he supposed to do? He couldn't wait until she was 18 because then she'd be dead. Let's see. Kess and... What is with you guys? And Youngster says Isaiah 7:14. Not sure exactly why, but let's take a look. So Isaiah 7:14. It says, therefore the Lord himself will give you a sign. The virgin will conceive and give birth to a son and will call him Emmanuel. Okay. So that's a prophecy about Jesus. And so what you're saying is that particular use of the word virgin, the Hebrew word, which let's take a look at Hebrew visibility on. I guess I should switch screens since you can't see what I'm doing here. So the word here is Alma. And Alma, girl, young woman, in certain contexts, virgin, young woman, girl, virgin, virgins. So it looks like, the word could mean simply a young woman or a virgin in the modern context. However, and this is actually interesting, youngster. So then what you need to do is look at the passage now, and then we can decide whether and which definition fits best. So let's look at, so therefore the Lord himself will give you a sign, number one. Now, a sign is a word is synonymous with miracle, with something. It's like when Jesus turned water into wine, when he walked on water, when he healed the sick, when he raised the dead. Those were all considered signs, right? So if we look at this passage, therefore the Lord himself will give you a sign. The virgin will conceive and give birth to a son, and we'll call him Emmanuel, which means God with us. Now, let's think this through for just a minute. If the word that's translated to virgin simply meant young woman in this passage, how is that a miraculous sign from God? To say, and God's going to give you this miraculous sign. A young woman will conceive and give birth to a son. Well, that happens all the time. That's not a sign, because there are always young women giving birth to sons. However, if going by the other meaning of the word, if the term actually is virgin, that would be miraculous. So when we look at Isaiah, I think that if we examine the context of the verses, it makes more sense that the Elma word means virgin as opposed to young woman. I interpret that to be a woman of marital age rather than strict virginity as traditionally understood from prophecy. I just broke that down. Let me know what you think of what I just said. Because how is it a miraculous sign that a woman of marriageable age had a kid? Stan says, though it was because he saved her life? Not sure what you mean there, Stan. Creep says, young woman is common translation. I wonder who started it. Well, I don't know. I mean, in the NIV, it says virgin. If we look at let's see. Let's look at the Holman Bible, which is a very recent translation. Holman Christian Standard. So the Holman Bible says, therefore the Lord himself will give you a sign, the virgin will conceive, have a son, and name him Emmanuel. So the Holman Bible calls her a virgin there. Trying to see let's go to the Message, which is a paraphrase, but let's see. Watch for this. A girl who is presently a virgin will get pregnant. So I'm not seeing, let's see. Where's the King James? No. Actually, this would be interesting. What's the Catholic Bible say? The Catholic Bible says, therefore the Lord himself will give you a sign. Behold, a young woman shall conceive and bear a son. So the Catholics, interestingly enough, because the Catholics literally worship Mary as being an eternal virgin, and yet in the Catholic translation, it says young woman, not virgin. I just find that absolutely hilarious. Let's see. And KJV, King James, says, therefore the Lord himself shall give you a sign. Behold, a virgin shall conceive. So far, just picking 5 different translations, the only one that seems to call her a young woman is, in fact, the Catholic translation, which I find truly, truly hilarious. Young woman is, you already read that. So young woman doesn't seem to be as common a translation as you think. But the Catholics are the largest denomination, so there's that. Therefore, Adonai himself will give you people a sign. A young woman will become pregnant, bear the son, and name him Emmanuel. So I assume you're reading the Jewish translation there. So the Catholics and the Jews, they're the ones that call her a young woman. Arabic said, didn't Jesus have a brother? Yes, his name was James, and he wrote the book of James. And interestingly about James is, while Jesus was still alive, he was unconvinced that he was the Messiah. Check the CJ. Well, I assume, yeah, you're doing the CJB because I don't know why you use that particular translation. That's just a weird translation to be using. But yeah, so that one does say young woman. So like I said, the Jewish translation and the Catholic translation seem to be the ones that that call her a young woman. Whereas almost at least every other translation I picked randomly from this list of translations called her a virgin. But the thing, again, Yuckster, it doesn't matter what the different translations say as much as what does the context say. And again, I ask you, what is a miraculous event? That a young woman gets pregnant or that a virgin gets pregnant? Because it is described as a miraculous event. Wonder when they changed it, the Catholics. Hard to say, because the Catholics used to, the translation I just read is a fairly recent one, and I don't study like the Latin Vulgate, so I don't know if it was like that in there, but probably not, because it was in Latin as opposed to English. But I don't know. I guess it's just because that word in Hebrew is kind of ambiguous. You could go either way. Jews write it on day one. Well, I don't know how old. I don't know the details on that particular translation that Youngster uses, so I can't say. But the Jews generally don't believe that Jesus was the Messiah, so to them, there's no problem just saying that Mary was just a young woman, but they don't believe that Mary was the mother of the Christ anyway. That being said, I think that, again, if you're going to say something is a miracle, then the next thing you describe should be miraculous. It shouldn't be mundane. And so, again, it's like, well, if I said, behold, there'll be a sign from God, the sun will rise. Well, the sun rises every day, right? And so, what are you trying to say? But if I say, behold, there'll be a sign from God that the sun will change to purple for a day or something. Okay, now you have something, right? Bipartisan religions, apparently. Youngster says, it comes down to translation. Well, again, I think that the differences that you see in the English translations, and that's one of the good things about having all these translations available to you, because you can try to clarify things. If you're unsure, that's when you look at context. And if you look at context, I think it's pretty obvious what the text is implying here, which is that Mary was untouched by a man and somehow was pregnant anyway. I don't understand how, I mean, honestly, looking at the context of it, I don't know how you could come up with anything else. I really don't. All right, anything else? That was interesting. Going once. Going twice. All right, so we'll wrap it up there and, try to make it through the day. And just remember, Thomas says, you haven't read the Bible until you read it in the original Klingon.